Hello, welcome to my 30th video in the series of my week at the club from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. This is Roger Capello bringing you the action as always. And this week I played a game in the first round of the George E. O'Rourke Memorial against Mike Commisso, who's a ambitious and aggressive player. And it was an interesting game. But before I get going, I'll give you my usual little astronomy tidbit. It's Mike in the upper right corner. It's astronomy. Picture in the middle there is not actually an image. It's an artist's concept of Neptune from its moon Triton with an ice geyser and, kind of a typical neat sort of thing that artists do. But what made me select this little piece of art was sort of not the qualities of the art itself, but a characteristic I find in typical of these that I thought about the day before yesterday when we had the big snowstorm, and it was snowing hard and it was very cloudy and quite dark outside. And it made me think of this thing that people often get wrong about the light level on the outer planets. Artists do, but so do non-artists. Authors, science fiction authors, talk about the twilight on Jupiter's moons and so on. And that's not the case. If you do a calculation, it seems like it ought to be. After all, Jupiter's 5 times as far from the sun as we are, so it gets 1/25 as much light. So that's only 4% of the light that we get on Earth. But 4% of the light makes a perceptible but not a very major difference in the light levels. So we had an annular eclipse here, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago in Massachusetts, where it was about a 96% eclipse of the sun. And the lighting looked a little odd outside, but it looked like a normal bright day. It really didn't look that different. And the reason is because your eyes are very logarithmic in their response, and they can look over a range of brightnesses of about a factor of 1,000,000 to 1. So when you get out to around Neptune or Pluto's distance from the sun, it's true you only get about 1/1000th of the light that you get when you're on the Earth, but that's still enough light to make it seem quite bright to you. It's about like a dark day on the Earth, like that day a couple days ago when it was snowing so heavily, and that's what it would be like in the vicinity of Pluto or Neptune. And so this sort of twilighty looking image, artist concept, although it looks nice, really it doesn't square too well with reality. Okay, on to the chess game. And this week we kind of wandered around on openings. We couldn't decide where it was we really wanted to be. So Mike opened up with e4, and I went to responded with a symmetric king pawn opening. And then he played bishop c4, which is the bishop's opening. And it's not played very much, but it can be pretty dangerous, as anybody who's faced it knows. And I played what is the most natural response to it, knight f6, because that shields this weak square on f7 that the bishop is pointing at, and which can often be a target. He replied with d4, which is a gambit in the bishop's opening. At this point, I was feeling like I was facing some preparation, and so I wanted to try to keep things quiet. And what I played is not the absolute most common move. Most commonly here, the pawn is captured, but instead I played, after a fair bit of thought, knight to c6. Hoping maybe that we would transpose into a 2 knights defense, which I've had more experience with. And Mike obliged me. He played knight to f3. So now we're in the 2 knights, and this position usually comes about after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, and then an immediate d4. And I actually play this position, have played it from both sides, more often from the white side. Against Paul Godin at the club, I guess, has been my most recent example. So after his move, I responded with taking the pawn. He castles, and then I played bishop d5, defending that pawn so that he can't easily recapture on d4. And now this will lead us into a Max Lang attack. Instead, I could have played something different. After castles, I could have taken the pawn on e5. And I played this quite a bit from the white side. I had a nice game once that I lost to John Curto on the white side of this. But it's actually considered to be quite a reasonable opening for black. And the line goes something like the rook is, or rather the knight is pinned by the rook along the e file, and it's protected by the d pawn, but that pawn can just be taken off by the bishop, because after the queen takes it, then the knight can come to c3 and attack both the queen and the knight. And this pawn here on d4 can't take the knight, because obviously it's pinned and you'd lose the queen. Then black actually has two choices here. Sometimes black will go to, well, step back here, black would go to either a4 or to a5 or to h5. I chose to go to h5. It's actually considered to be a little bit better. And then white gets his piece back with a threatening a dangerous discovered check along the e file. Black has to close up the file. White attacks that pinned piece. Black castles long, which is going to give a pawn back. After knight takes bishop, pawn takes, rook takes. We've got even material again. Black has a queenside pawn majority, white has a kingside pawn majority, and it's thought to be slightly better for black, actually, in this position. But Mike was having none of that, and instead, after I defended the pawn bishop to c5, he went ahead and pushed the e-pawn to attack the knight. And this is the Max Lang attack, as I said before. Black responds by d5, and that forces the bishop to do something. He went ahead and took the knight. I took the pawn. He checks on the e-file. This is all a fairly forced line now. I have to block with the bishop to e6. He plays knight g5, and I played queen d5. And as I say in my notes there, it actually, by this point, I'd spent quite a bit of time. Out of the 100 minutes of the game, I've spent 25 minutes. I was down to 75 by here. And I actually had to discover queen to d5. The problem back here is I was originally, back when we were aiming toward this position, I was planning to take with the pawn with the queen, thinking that this would be good for me. But now I realize that it isn't, because if knight takes bishop, and of course the queen can't take back because the rook's attacking that square, so the knight has to be taken with the pawn, and then the queen could come out here, check, and whether the queen blocks or the king moves, either way, let's block with the queen, say, this bishop here over on c5 is loose and gets picked up, and I'm down a piece. So I couldn't go in for that line. Oh, I say I already had put that in my notes, and after queen to h5, the other possibility of g6 is no better, because he still picks up the piece on c5. So I couldn't do that. It took me a while, but I discovered that queen d5 was the only move, really. It was the box move for to defend that loose bishop on c5. And we continue on down the main line. I realized when I went to d5 that he would be able to attack me, because similar to the move in the line that I showed you earlier, this d pawn is pinned. It doesn't look like it's pinned because my queen is defended by the bishop, but the bishop is also pinned. There's a double pin going on here. So, for example, if black were so silly as to play pawn takes, white would just play queen takes on d5, and now he's won a whole queen because this bishop is pinned. So after knight c3, I went ahead with what I was planning, which was queen to f5. And now after that move, he played knight on c to e4. It turns out that's the main line. But I actually was glad to see it, because I was more afraid of g4 but g4 is not as good, even though it's okay for white. It's not as good as playing the knight to e4. And the reason is that I can drop back with my queen. Of course, I can't afford to take the pawn for the same reason as before, with my loose bishop on c5. I drop back with my queen to g6, where it keeps an eye on. Actually, it's not true. Okay, let's go here. I just was noticing as I was saying that I couldn't afford to make that move that wasn't really true, because that allows the, after queen takes f6, that would allow the D knight to come into, or sorry, the C knight to come into d5, attacking the queen, and the weak pawn on c7. That variation actually turns out to be bad. I thought that the same variation would be true, but of course the queen is blocked out from coming over and giving check now with g4. Anyway, getting a little carried away there in lines. So he played the main line, knight ce4. And I castled, which is still following the main line. And at this point, I think there were 30 or so games in the book, but none of them followed the move that Mike chose, which was knight to g3. And actually, the best move at this point was to go ahead and to play, instead of knight to g3 in this position, to play g4. And now the line, I was worried about g4. I was thinking my main, I would have reconsidered it, but my main idea was to play my queen back to d5. But the main line is actually to play the queen to e5. Then the g-pawn, the f-pawn takes the g-pawn, the rook has to move. He trades off the knight for the bishop, and then he brings the bishop out to defend that pawn on g7. And this is slightly in white's favor. So g4 would have been good for him. Knight g3, not so much, because now it's definitely in black's favor. So I'll turn off the engine here, so we don't have a din. And after he retreated knight to g3 and attacked my queen, I had to go somewhere. Fortunately, my bishop's no longer under threat of attack, so I'm able to take the pawn on f6. He moved his other pawn to where it attacks my queen. And not only is he attacking my queen, but he's threatening now to play this bishop out to g5, where it would skewer my queen and my rook. We can't have that, so I have to move the queen somewhere, and I chose to move it to e7. He went ahead and played the bishop to g5 anyway, and I think that was probably his best move. This wins back one of his pawns, right? And that's based upon my bishop that's still loose on c5 now. My queen's going to end up being overworked, so I have to stop this skewer at this point by pushing my f-pawn, and he sacks his bishop for the pawn. But then now he can just go ahead and take that bishop on c5, because my queen is having to defend both the bishop on e6, and the bishop was defending the bishop on c5. So I have to let one of those go. I chose to leave the e bishop go, and then he takes it, and now he's got back one of his two pawns. So I'm just one pawn ahead at this point, but I still like black's position reasonably well. I have this nice open c file leading to his king. I have two very aggressive pawns in his territory, and my king is reasonably safe on c8. I was a little worried about moves like queen to g4 at some point, threatening a discovered check, such things as that. So for that reason, I played my queen to g5 to take over some of those squares. But then Mike had a good response for that, which was to just come to f3 with his queen. And now he is, let's see, where are we at here? There it is. So at this point now, he's threatening to win this f-pawn. He has it attacked twice. And maybe in some variations, thinking about sacking his rook over here on c6. So I decided to play actively with my queen, since I didn't want to get passive and just put a rook on this file to defend the f-pawn. Instead, I went after his pawns, infiltrating with queen to d2. But the problem with that, of course, is that he could simply play his rook back to e2 and chase my queen out of there. The computer suggested d3 at this point. And let's see, d3, like so. And I considered this move and looked at after c takes, me recapturing the pawn and having possibly a weak pawn on d3. But the computer, of course, has an improvement on that, which is to play the knight into the d4 square that I just vacated. That's forking the queen and rook. It doesn't actually win the exchange because white can simply take the pawn now, and I can't take the rook because, yes, I can. I was going to say because my queen is hanging, but of course the knight defends the queen. So if the knight took the rook, then he could simply trade off. Actually, this seems like a good line for black. Let's see, in the interest of time here. Yeah, the computer also likes this reasonably well for black. So that was another possibility. But the best line that it liked after queen takes f6 was actually to play queen f2, where the rook would still be under attack, and now I would have real threats against the white king, because there's a threat of me playing rook to f8, and after the queen moves, taking an f2 check. And so he'd have to get into a defensive shell, rook to f1. So that's even stronger, but I could go ahead and win the exchange in that line. I didn't see that, though. I thought it was just going to be a trade of pawns, and after c takes, I was going to take back with my pawn, and now this pawn on d3 is a threatening passed pawn, but it could also be encircled by his rooks and queen and fall. I didn't want that to happen. So I didn't do that. Instead, I went ahead and played, let's move back here, queen to d2. As I said, he did not play his rook to e2. Instead, he went ahead and sacked the exchange on c6. And this is interesting because after I take and he takes back, now he has some real threats of a perpetual check. But I had looked at this ahead of time and felt that after queen b4, which is what I played, that I could stop his any perpetual checks that he might try to use on me. He played a move that surprised me, c3. At the time, I didn't realize why, because it just seems to be giving up this b pawn. But the idea, I think, was that he wanted to shield that e1 square from my queen so they could play his rook over there on the next move. Because after I took the b pawn, that's exactly what he did. And now the idea is to bring the rook into the attack, probably through e7. Let's scroll up here so you can see the game. It turns out at this point that instead of playing rook to e1 immediately like that, a better move, according to the computer, would just be to go ahead and check. And if I want to get out of the perpetual check, I've got to drop my queen back, and then his rook on a1 is no longer under attack, and he can bring his queen back, and it's putting black in a more defensive posture. So that would have been an interesting idea for white. But instead he followed through with rook to e1, and that allowed me to go ahead and push my passed pawn, which passed pawns like to get pushed. And he played the move I expected, and I thought was his best move, but it turns out that it's not his best move. That causes the evaluation to swing strongly in black's favor. And so he played queen takes the c pawn. And the problem is, it comes up in a move or two. I missed the best continuation. But the reason this is a real problem for white is that I go ahead and push my d pawn, which I did, and he has to blockade it with his rook on d1, which is not a happy thing to do. And then I continued properly with rook to e8, the other rook to e8. Now that's threatening to come down with the rook, obviously to e1 check, and he can't take because I would take back and make a queen and checkmate him, or at least actually just win the rook, but it would lead eventually to checkmate. And he would have to do something like put my, well, I mean, doesn't have to do it immediately. He could drop back with the queen back to f1, but what he did do was to check with the queen to move my king to a somewhat more exposed position, and then drop back with his queen to f1. And at this point, I was getting short on time. I'm not sure. Let's see, this is my 26th move. I didn't record the time here. Let's say I ended up with 11 minutes, and I had 39 on the 18th move, so I'm somewhere in between those. I probably had about 20 minutes or so. I was starting to feel a little pressured by the clock at this point. And although I realized that this next combination didn't work, it was a way of simplifying the position. And I still have a winning position. But what really would have been much better at this point would have been to play queen takes c3. I didn't see that. And the reason that's so much better is because if he comes out and checks me, I can hide my king in the corner, and now he can't check me with the queen. And yet I'm threatening that rook to e1, now supported by my queen as well. So my queen and pawn both are supporting this e1 square. That's what's so strong. So white is reduced to blocking at advance with the knight. The rook comes in anyway. He doesn't want to play rook takes rook. Pawn becomes a queen. So he has nothing better than to go ahead and take the pawn. And then I win his rook. And now it's 2 rooks for a knight. And he doesn't even have a check in this position without giving up material. So this is, I don't know, something like minus 20 and climbing when I looked at it with the computer. So it's, you know, there are no hidden gotchas here in this line. Would have been very good. Unfortunately, I didn't see it, or we'd be done talking by now. Instead, I played the rook to e1. He went ahead and captured it, which is winning my nice passed pawn. And I can win the a-pawn. I should win the a-pawn. That would be the best move at this point. Instead, I played the c2, threatening to play my rook down, pinning his queen to the king. But that's easily dodged with knight to f1, and I end up just taking the pawn anyhow. So that was a wasted move at that point. He has to make luft for his king before he can get his knight and queen active. He really wants to get those into the position. And I made a weak move here. Queen to a4, again with the idea of playing the rook to the back rank if the knight should move. But I mean, it's not even a threat because, you know, if the knight comes out to e3, it's actually covering d1 anyhow. So this threat of rook up isn't really very much of a threat at all. But even more to the point, it loses a pawn. So he could simply, if he wanted to, well, actually, he does do the check. So he played queen to b1 check. My king has to move, and then he could just take my h-pawn, and should take my h-pawn. That's his best move at this point, and get back to material equality. Instead, he played the queen to f5, and that is not as good. That gives me time to put my queen into a consolidating position where I block the checks and also take over this light square diagonal leading into his king's position. So that keeps his king kind of locked in a box here. And so he made more luft for the king, but of course this is weakening the pawn structure around the king even further. And so I played queen to c3, which will defend this the f-pawn that he was threatening to take, and is also threatening to it's closer to the king, it's threatening to enter into his position. After he played the king to h2, I made the move queen to d3, which is forking the queen and the knight. And so I think Mike felt that he had to trade queens at this point, in which case I'm up a couple of passed pawns. Well, I'm up one pawn, but I have two passed pawns, and I would have the rook for the knight. And it would be, in particular, it would be very hard for him to stop the A pawn. So he resigned. But in reality, of course, at this point, he doesn't have to resign. What he could do is to go ahead and take the pawn, and even though I get his knight, he's now attacking my rook. He can take it with check, and I play king back, and now it's just about a perpetual. But I don't think it is, because my king can escape out. But nevertheless, it's, he can play on in this position. So let's double check this. No, there is a perpetual. So I thought my king would be able to run over to the queen side here, but after queen d5, I thought the king would maybe come here to a6 and get to where the queen could shield it. But that's not the case. Queen c6, yep. King a5, queen c7. Yeah, this would not have been good. Nevertheless, I didn't have to actually allow that to happen. Obviously, I don't need to take the knight, and without taking a knight, there are still possibilities. Although it's not an easy game for black, especially as the clock's starting to loom. So I think maybe Mike resigned a little prematurely, but I was happy to see it, and all gifts gratefully accepted. And next time you get me in a position like that, just push on and try a few more moves and see what happens. This is my only advice. So it was a fun game. That was just the very first round of the tournament, and so next week I'll move up a board. As you can see, I was on board 4 this week. I slipped a little bit in rating, and so I'll be moving up to board 3 because there was a draw in the higher boards. So until then, this is RJC signing off from the Wachusett Chess Club. Bye-bye.